Yes, sir. Just for the first.
The gentleman from Virginia, it's not required that you go the entire 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on the topic of the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, of all of the harm done over the past 3 years by Democrats, perhaps most damaging has been the loss of faith and trust in our most sacred institutions, especially our judicial system and our federal law enforcement. Like never before, the Department of Injustice has explicitly demonstrated a willingness to target conservatives and political opponents. They're not even pretending anymore. Whether conducting SWAT raids in tactical gear at the homes of pro-life protesters, targeting and arresting concerned parents at school board meetings, buying private data on those exercising their Second Amendment rights, surveilling Catholics practicing their faith in Richmond, or the disparate treatment of January 6th prisoners, it's no surprise that half of the country doesn't trust the people in power in this administration. Of course, their biggest and most immediate target is the 47th President of the United States, because they know that Donald J. Trump is the primary obstacle to their quest to conquer and control the citizens of the United States, stripping them of their pesky constitutional freedoms. The egregious lawfare, the abusive legal persecution of President Trump is nothing more than election interference at the highest levels. It's a violation of voters' rights. It's criminal conspiracy. Their aim is to put in jail the only person, President Trump, who's protecting the American people from 4 more years of descent into an abyss from which we would never recover. Democrats know, with our country and every American far worse off than they were 3 years ago, they cannot beat President Trump at the ballot box. Whether you're talking about the border invasion, whether you're talking about the surrender of our energy independence, whether you're talking about the onslaught of regulations that's costing the average family thousands of dollars, whether you're talking about the inflation, the 40-year high inflation that Americans are suffering under, whether you're talking about our weakened military or our weakened foreign policy and the conflicts all over the world that didn't exist when President Trump was in office, Americans in this country are much worse off than they were 3 years ago when President Trump was in office. So the Department of Injustice, because they cannot beat him at the ballot box in November, they collude illegally and unconstitutionally with these rogue prosecutors and judges in New York and in Atlanta. They send Matthew Coangelo from Department of Justice to New York. They corroborate with Fani Willis's boyfriend, who bills the Georgia taxpayers for hours spent working with the Department of Justice. The judge in New York City, who just happens to be assigned somehow every high-profile case of persecution of high-profile conservatives, he abuses his power by declaring a gag order, not to ensure the defendant, President Trump, gets a fair trial, but to prevent President Trump, the defendant, from defending himself in the court of public opinion. The efforts to rig the 2020 election included the suppression of conservative views, the phony Russia collusion scandal, the spying on the Trump campaign, the dirty Steele dossier, the relaxation of voting procedures in the name of COVID to facilitate the ability to cheat. Their efforts to rig the 2024 election, however, are much more explicit and transparent. Prevent President Donald Trump from being on the ballot. Or when that failed, keep him off the campaign trail and bleed his resources. Or better still, the coup de grace for them, put him in jail via dishonest convictions in crooked courts while he waits for what will surely be certain victory by appeal. As always with these people, the process is the punishment. In fact, this judge in this New York City trial, his daughter is raising millions of dollars off the trial for the Democrat Party. the ex-con, the star witness, admitted today to multiple counts of perjury in his testimony under oath. These ridiculous trials, so-called improper business records, so-called overvaluation of assets, alleged document mishandling in Florida for a president who can declare anything declassified by simply possessing it. Election interference alleged, that's rich coming from the Democrat Party and these rogue prosecutors colluding with the DOJ. All of this began when President Trump declared his candidacy for re-election. Who was harmed with these alleged crimes? Who were the victims? And what was the real crime? Of course, no one, and nothing. But this is not going to work. The American people know it for what it is. The truth and the law are on the side of President Trump, and he's going to be the 47th president. And with that, I yield as much time as he would like to my friend from Arizona, Chairman Andy Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Thank you for doing this. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, are you the Speaker or are you acting as Chairman? Speaker. Okay, good. Speaker pro tem, right. Very good. Then I'll call you Mr. Speaker. I'm going to try to dovetail on what Mr. Good has talked about, and that is the weaponization of the federal government against American citizens for political purposes. It's bad enough when it becomes weaponized against American citizens, but it becomes actually exponentially worse when it becomes a tool of authoritarianism to actually attack political opponents. Now, why is it worse? It's worse because it undermines the very foundation of the rule of law and of the free association and of the free speech of American citizens, from which we recognize all of our political apparatus. So let's think about this. We know the Subcommittee on Weaponization recently put out a report dealing with the misuse of financial records of Americans. Now imagine if the federal government could get hold of everybody's credit card statement. Well, they can, actually. Why can they? Because they've asked for it, and the banks and the credit card companies, many of them, have actually turned that information over to the FBI and Department of Justice. And for what reason? There's no particular reason. There's no indicia of probable cause or suspicious behavior. They're just acquiring metadata so they can go after and pursue individuals. We see the same thing with this movement to buy up additional metadata from data brokers, private commercial data brokers. They do that so they can avoid the requirements of suspicious conduct or probable cause. That's what went on when the FBI actually did millions of queries on American citizens and did hundreds of thousands of illegal searches of the data of American citizens. They didn't have probable cause. There was nothing, according to statute, this is part of the problem with the FISA statute. They had no reason to believe that any of those searches would lead to finding criminal conduct. And yet they still went after these American citizens. The DOJ and judiciary are joined by the ATF. The ATF has been going after federally firearm licensees, distributors, and going after them and trying to find technical errors showing up, because this is the way the Biden administration is trying to disarm the American public. So it just goes on. Every institution has been weaponized. The military has been weaponized. And it looks like General Perry's here, so he might want to talk about that. The education system is weaponized. You know what happens when you have a have a generation or two that has been indoctrinated into how bad this country is, that we have no moral high ground, we don't respect freedom, that we're going to basically embrace critical race theory and that type of thing. Well, first of all, you remember that when they did this, they said there is no such thing as critical race theory. That's what the Democrats said here. We're in judiciary. We had debates on it. They said there's no such thing. Of course there is such a thing. Critical theory it grew right out of the Frankfurt School, the philosophical group that was led by Jürgen Habermas and the other folks who came, Anthony Adorno and the others in the Frankfurt School, and they came over. And they created critical theory. And then in the early 70s, a law professor created the notion of critical race theory. He published articles. It was adopted. And the reality is, what's happened with that is you have an indoctrinated generation which believes that America is no good, was no good, and will never be good because it is systemically, inherently problematic. And it's not just critical race theory. There's a whole bundle of other critical arguments related to critical theory. You have district attorneys and county attorneys who have run on the notion that those who commit violent crimes are misunderstood and should be released into the public, and that those who are victimized become marginalized, which is why I introduced the Alvin Bill, which was to get at Mr. Bragg in New York, and the Willis Act. And what are these meant to do? They're meant to use what the founders gave us within the Constitution, which is our opportunity to use the funding streams and the purse strings to actually try to bring a runaway executive branch back in. Well, this all culminates in today's actions. So what do we see happening? I won't steal my friend's thunder because he was talking about former President Donald Trump, who's undergoing 4 pieces of lawfare. And those lawfare originated right in the White House. They're coming down from President Biden. Well, how do we know that? Because the paramour of Fani Willis came up and met in the White House to get instructions. How do we know that? Because Jack Smith, who's prosecuting him here on the Mar-a-Lago case, he went to the White House multiple times to get instructions. How do we know that? Because Alvin Bragg also met with the White House. How do we know that? Because Michael Colangelo, one of the high-ranking DOJ lawyers, left that DOJ and went to Alvin Bragg's office after Alvin Bragg and everybody else who looked at the case that's going on in New York City had said, there is no there there. And by the way, they probably were also told, your 2-star witnesses are Stormy Daniels, who's basically said on multiple times, 4 different times she said, there was never any interaction between me and Donald Trump. And then Michael Cohen, who has a long string of convictions for lying. He lied about lying. Then he lied about lying today. We saw it in the hours of testimony we saw. And so the next step is, how else do you weaponize government? You use it to shield bad acts from the public. So let me give you one, and then before I yield, this is my last one. Today, the Judiciary Committee voted to hold Merrick Garland in contempt of court. Tonight, I anticipate the Oversight Committee will do the same. What did the Biden administration do? President Biden has asserted executive privilege. Now, I want you to think about this for just a moment. The rationale for the executive privilege, based on what Merrick Garland said today, both in an oral and written statement, was this. He said, look, 2 reasons. Number one, we're not going to be able to pursue sensitive investigations. He didn't say how that works, but that is not a reason for executive privilege. It isn't. The other thing with regard to executive privilege is they talked about politics and the political ramification if this audio recording was released. Now, you've already released the transcript, by the way. Both of those arguments are undercut because you've already released a written transcript. The only reason not to bring out the recording is because you were abashed, embarrassed, because you either doctored your transcript, your written transcript, or because the performance is so egregiously bad on the oral transcript. And so neither of those will work. And I'm going to call right now and remind everybody that we can take actions here, and we should. And I will just tell you that that is another way that you can weaponize government, and that is to hide information, fail to be transparent. And that's what this administration has done. And with that, I thank the gentleman for yielding me some time, and I'll yield back to him.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, esteemed member of the Judiciary Committee. And now it's my pleasure to recognize my good friend from Pennsylvania, the General and Chairman Scott Perry.
Well, I thank the Chairman of the House Freedom Caucus and the former House Chairman, or Chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. I'm happy to join in a colloquy with them over the abuses of power and the dangers of the abuse of power. The framers of the Constitution noted it was the avarice of man, the avarice of mankind, the greed of mankind that compelled them to set this government up the way they did, so that there were three separate but co-equal branches that would compete with one another and hold each other in check, Mr. Speaker. But it all depended on a few things. It depended on a public. It depended on men and women that would take care, that would put things above themselves that are bigger than themselves. It depended on a people that believed in the sanctity and the providence of God. Mr. Speaker, it's a little ripped up here because I carry it with me everywhere, but this is the Constitution of the United States of America. I think you can clearly see it is a piece of paper for all intents and purposes. It cannot defend itself. It rides around in my pocket. It depends on people of integrity to defend it, to uphold it. And this judicial system we have, this system of justice we have, is no different. If people are willing to abuse it, it can no more defend itself than this piece of paper known as the Constitution can defend itself. It depends on us. And when it is so willingly abused for the avarice, for the greed of mankind, there's little that can be done about it. This body can do little. And unfortunately, the little we can do has shown no interest in doing, which is the power of funding it. So unfortunately, while we see the abuses, while we watch the abuses front and center, the power that we have to say we'll stop it, we've unfortunately given them more authority, given them more money than they've even asked for to continue to abuse it. My friends, my colleagues, visited a courthouse today with the former president of the United States for a case which there's no crime enumerated, because there is no crime. Specious witnesses, to say the least, unfortunately. It's a sad tale, no matter which way you look at it. Mr. Colangelo, the reason I'm bringing it up, the former speaker brought it up, is because you know who can't bring it up? The defendant. The former president of the United States as a defendant can't bring it up because there's been a gag order placed on him. Mr. Speaker, the gag orders are meant and I'm not an attorney, but I think my good friend from Arizona would admit, to protect the accused. Yet the accused is the one who can't speak on his own in his own defense, on his own behalf. Meanwhile, the people that are accusing him, the awesome, unbelievable power of the state. When I say the state, the government, the federal government, unlimited resources provided by taxpayers. That is what the accused is up against. And so, because we have seen from history that the accused is the one that is little able to defend themselves, guilty or not guilty, that we want to provide every single protection to the accused just in case, Mr. Speaker, that they might not be guilty as charged. Yet in this instance, the avarice of man, the avarice and the guilt, the greed of mankind has compelled this side of the aisle to go after with such a vengeance and use the instruments and the authority of the federal government to go after their political rivals. They are blinded by their greed. They are blinded by their hatred. They are blinded by their need to control power so much that they'll do anything. And they have done anything. We're watching the case in Florida where now we found out the evidence was tampered with, and oh my goodness, it sure appears like forget the evidence being tampered with, because it's being tampered with the same people that appear to have set up the whole charade in the first place. Again, against their political rival, the former president of the United States, who might very well be the next president of the United States. And I say all that to say this. History has shown us, and if you've traveled at all and watched conflicts around the world, that these injuries that occur from one side to the other tend to repeat themselves because then if there's going to be a redress, in other words, if there's going to be a fix or a solution to that egregious misuse of power, then the other side is compelled to it when they are in a position of authority. And it takes the unbelievable will and integrity to say, we're not going to engage in that kind of thing. If we're in a position of authority, we are not going to succumb to the greed and the avarice of mankind if you put us in authority. Mr. Speaker, we all fall short of the grace of God, and the temptation can be overwhelming, which is why it's so important that both sides lay down their greed and say, we are going to try and do this fair and square. We're going to try and do this the right way. We are going to try and win the argument and not use the instruments of federal power where we otherwise could. We're not going to do that. Unfortunately, we are in the uncharted territory of the United States of America where that's not the case. This is the charted territory of many despots and dictators and tyrants around the globe throughout history, and now it has come home to America, unfortunately, in one of the major political parties in the United States of America. And we're watching it weaponized not only against President Trump, but average citizens who fear that they might speak, that they might be held in contempt, and they might be bankrupted by somebody that disagrees with them politically. And I'll just turn it back over to my good friend from Virginia and thank him for the time and for bringing the subject up.
Thank you, Chairman Perry. Now I'm going to go back to Chairman Biggs from Arizona for some final thoughts.
Thank you. And I appreciate both of the Chairman Good and Chairman Perry in their comments. I want to add just a couple of things. We are a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy. A constitutional republic actually elects representatives to make decisions and represent the will of a district or a state. That's the distinction. A democracy is actually demos. It's where the people themselves are voting directly on the issues and decisions to be made. That's really what happens in a democracy, which is why the founders warned us and said, you have a constitutional republic. You don't have a democracy. You don't have a democracy, because democracies have been short and turbulent in their destruction. And as one historian said in about 1804, it has been the sad history of democracies that as soon as people realize they can vote themselves benefits from the government, they do so, and the government terminates. So we have a constitutional republic, and we have separation of powers, both horizontally and vertically. James Madison taught us very clearly that we should honor those separations rigidly. And so when we talk about horizontally, we always think of the legislative branch, executive branch, and judiciary, which, are, by the way, are not co-equal branches. That's right. The founders were very clear on this. They described the judiciary as the weakest branch. We control their jurisdiction, except for in a few cases of original jurisdiction. We create the Article III courts, with the exception of the United States Supreme Court. The executive branch, very limited powers. In fact, they thought the executive branch itself, the presidency, would be more ceremonial than substantive. And the legislative branch would be small with enumerated powers, but because it was elected, the House of Representatives was elected directly by the people, it would have the purse strings. And the Senate was to be elected by the state legislatures. And they were to represent the state interests. Well, what's happened is we're upside down. We're so upside down because every state, having spent many years in the state legislature, and I think my colleagues have, you know this. What happens is this. We spent about 80% of our time in the state of Arizona trying to respond to federal mandates passed by this bunch of yo-yos or by the bureaucracy, where they were telling us things like, gee, in Phoenix, Arizona, what we want you to do is we want you to water down your dust, because the number one particulate in Arizona's, in the Phoenix metro area, is dust. That's your biggest pollutant. Water it down. And the other half of EPA saying, you can't water it down because we're watching you on your water usage. These are from people who are cubicle dwellers who are controlling, without any understanding, 5.5 million people in the Phoenix metro area. And they become weaponized. They're nameless, they're faceless. They are the DC cartel, which consists of bureaucracy, media, lobbyists. That is your cartel. And they have taken the institutions of this country and they've weaponized them against the American people. It's time for this body to say we are the ones closest to the people, and we must do all we can. We may not have leverage over the Senate now. We may not have leverage over the executive branch now, but we must do and can do everything possible to restore the separation of powers, both horizontally and vertically. If we did that, I guarantee you what would happen is this weaponization would dissipate. It wouldn't go quietly in the night, but we have felt it wrap around our necks like the flaxen cords of sin, and we have got to begin cutting it off. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs. Thank you, Chairman Perry. We have seen over the last 3 years the consequence of electing people who will abuse power, weaponize the federal government against citizens and political opponents, carry out disparate justice treatment based on political views. You both, Chairman Perry and Chairman Biggs, have spoken eloquently about the Constitution, our true north, our compass, which is just a minor inconvenience to the folks on the other side, who take a mentality of, show me the man, I'll show you the crime. We cannot let them win in this endeavor. We must hold them accountable. That's why it was a privilege today to go up, Mr. Speaker, and defend our former president and future president of the United States for the abuse of power that's being directed at him right now as they target truly the American people and as he stands in their way. With that, I yield back.
Does the gentleman have a motion?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.